So tell me about culture. I haven't unfortunately yet had an opportunity of
No,
reading it.
because it's amazing that
Yeah.
that they pushed out this international version for the event. It
Mm.
was very fast. It's really impressive. I mentioned yesterday. So, in some ways, it's a follow up to the written world in that it's another, you know, broad sweep.
Mm.
So in that sense, it's similar. But the question I wanted to ask is really why do humans produce these useless objects
Mhm.
uh, that become art objects? And I start with the earliest, with cave art,
Mhm.
35,000 years ago. And then I go to the present, and it's sort of a history of, I think, it's called The Story of Us in is the American subtitle. I do think of it as sort of a species story,
Mm.
that humans keep making these things that have no practical purpose, but that clearly um, are taken very seriously, are very important, but also very contested. So why? And what kind of story of these objects can one tell? And so in some sense, the question I started to ask is how does culture actually work?
Mhm.
Because biological evolution, it's all passed on automatically, so to speak, through our genes and, gene variations and all of that. But with culture, we somehow need to find external devices to pass it on to the next generation. If we don't pass it down, it disappears, right? So I started to focus on these institutions that humans have evolved that pass down culture to the next generation. And caves are one of the first
Right.
institutions. So I start with the Chauvet caves. Um, and the sort of model I developed with the Chauvet caves is that for thousands of years, humans worked on these caves. It's really this enormous intergenerational process and project, generation after generation after generation. And then a landslide closed off the cave for a couple of thousand years. And then after a couple of thousand years, another landslide opens it up again. And so a completely different group of humans
Mm. Wow.
can enter these caves and they see these cave paintings that they have no connection to it thousands of years, and they continue somehow this work. And that for me became sort of a mini example of how culture works, because we are always confronted with some remnant from the past, and no one knows exactly how it worked and what people meant. And sometimes it's only a broken piece of pottery or some foundation stone or something that gets found after hundreds of thousands of years. So we always in trying to figure out what does that mean and how can we continue to use it in some ways. And so I started to think of culture very much driven by latecomers,
Mhm.
like that second group of humans that enter the cave and find that their very distant predecessors, have created something amazing, but why and how and so on and so forth, they may not know, but they're nevertheless somehow continuing this work.
This reminds me of how you had mentioned that clay tablet in your first book
Mm,
and how it passed on the knowledge to the next
yes,
generation. That was also an object. This is
yes,
bridging.
absolutely. But what I think in this book, what became clear to me is the interruptions in some way. So one chapter is on Ashoka's inscriptions,
Okay.
and I think and I don't have to lecture you on those, but what became so fascinating is that he puts these stone edicts and pillars all around his realm, has them inscribed, um, but then after a few hundred years, the script falls out of use and they become illegible. And yet people still cherish them and they use them and they have oral stories around what the script means. But there's in some sense, there's no continuity. The script gets forgotten, and then it gets rediscovered much later. So it's a lot about this kind of, when you create culture, you think about the future. Ashoka was in some sense inscribing these pillars. He writes about that, sending them like messages to the future, but doesn't always work. There are often these interruptions.
Right.
And then, but then through these interruptions, nevertheless, something continues.
But is it because of our innate nature to leave a legacy behind that these all, I mean, you said 35,000 years ago.
Yeah.
How did you start the research work? I mean, where did the idea initially came from?
You know, the idea, I think it, as I said, it came sort of from this, I've been working in culture and writing about cultural objects for many decades, but I think I never really asked myself, how does culture work? What's the logic? What's the mechanism?
No.
The deep mechanism? How is it transmitted?
Right.
And what are the difficulties of this transmission? And so I started to sort of ask this question and look for case studies that 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 seem to reveal these mechanisms, and that the cave was one mechanism, Ashoka's pillar was another mechanism, and many others. So I started to look around, look everywhere. Where are these moments where culture tells me how it works?
And when you mentioned the interruptions that happened, they must have changed the entire trajectory of the culture. For example, what Ashoka wanted to initially communicate, and the latecomers, what they perceived.
Right.
I mean, it could be a totally different picture of a
Absolutely.
third culture altogether.
That's exactly right. So, Ashoka wanted to clearly communicate something about Buddhism and about, this proselytizing to some extent, this different, new idea of how to be in the world and human society, very powerfully, very movingly. Then the script gets forgotten. And then the next person who comes across one of these pillars, hundreds and like 700 years later, is Firoz Shah Tughluq,
Okay.
who doesn't know how to read it. It's part of this Muslim dynasty, but he sees this pillar and transports it to his palace in Delhi without knowing what it says. And so he, in some sense, uses it for his own purposes, but he also knows that this is from a previous, civilization, and you could say he sort of appropriates it, or he wants to be associated with it. But it's also there; it's sitting there the entire time, and then later it gets deciphered again. So, but you're absolutely right. Through these interruptions or misunderstandings, something very unexpected can happen, not intended by Ashoka or anyone else. So there are lots of stories like that of sort of unintended consequences.
Is there a life cycle to the culture? I mean, time period wise and the context?
I suppose there are life cycles. I'm sure you could say that nothing lasts forever.
Yeah.
In some cultures have longer life cycles and are shorter. But what I find even more interesting in the book is to see how many of these objects move through different life cycles. So, for example, in another chapter, I talk about the small South Asian statue that gets brought to Rome, to Pompeii.
Okay.
And then in 79 AD, the volcano buries Pompeii, and this Indian statue gets preserved. So we now know that there was this commerce between South Asia and Rome, the Roman Empire. And so, it moved from one culture to another, and then through this time capsule, essentially, this is what Pompeii became, into the present. And so, yeah, many of these stories have objects or ideas that sort of move from one life cycle, if you will, to another.
So fascinated with such intricate details. It's mind blowing. Any particular aspect of any particular culture that you wish to talk about, which influenced you for your writing, or maybe well, not influenced, maybe which fascinated you? You know, you just had a wow, this happened. Something.
So, everything I've mentioned so far, the Chauvet Cave, the Ashoka Pillar, this Indian statue, and Compare are one of my favorite examples. But there's one more that I really love, and that's the Ethiopian scribal text Kebra Nagast.
Okay.
It's from the final form. It took us in the 14th century, and it tells a really wild story. It uses the biblical story of the Queen of Sheba visiting King Solomon. And in the Bible, she comes and she's heard that King Solomon is wise, and she comes, from the south to visit and to examine and to cross-examine King Solomon. Is he really all that great?
Mm.
And spends a few days with King Solomon, and then she goes back and is impressed and goes back. That's the Queen of Sheba. In the Kebra Nagast, this story is taken as the beginning, but here it says that she actually became pregnant, had a child from him, went back. The child grows up in Ethiopia. Then she sends him back to his father, King Solomon, with a ring to identify him as his son. King Solomon accepts him as his son and wants the son to stay, become king of Jerusalem. But the son says, no, I want to go back to Ethiopia, and goes back. And so King Solomon sends him back with a sort of entourage. But before they leave, they steal the 10 Commandments and take them to Aksum in Ethiopia. And that becomes the beginning of Ethiopian Christianity.
Wow.
So that's and so this is an incredible story. And then there's a sort of second part to it. So this is, in a way, the foundational story, the sacred text of Ethiopian Christianity.
Mm.
And then in the early 20th century, halfway around the world in Jamaica, is this search in some sense for a Caribbean Black identity. So there's a lot of interest in Africa and search for African traditions.
Mm.
So they can come across this text, Kebra Nagast, in the story of Ethiopia, and they adopt this story as their own sort of culture, and that becomes the origin of Rastafaris. So it's another sort of adoption of a very distant culture for your own purposes.
You know, when I visualize what you're saying, I have a forest in my mind and a seed flying away to a distant desert and creating a forest of its own.
I think that's a lovely metaphor. That's a lovely metaphor.
But wow, how these things evolve with such a beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm totally lost of, at a loss of questions. Brilliant. Awesome. So any particular aspect of the book which you want to, I mean, as we were talking about the aspect of building a culture. So, you mentioned how a culture transgresses or transforms. There are two aspects to it which I see from a naive perspective. One is a culture is intentionally created.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other is it unintentionally evolves on its own. So what is the difference between either of them? And then if somebody wants to create something, how does that,
Yeah.
both the aspects,
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great distinction. I think that's really true because I think one of the things that attracts me to these unusual objects is yes, that they are intentional. Someone, not just individuals, but often many individuals, in some cases with the caves, probably hundreds of individuals over the course of thousands of years produce these, but enormous resources go into them. They're not just something you do casually on the side. They're very intentional, as you say, and they're clearly created very intentionally as in order to help make meaning, make sense of the world, to articulate an individual or a group's place in the world and how they see themselves and how they make meaning. But then, and I love your metaphor of the seed that flows away, then in some sense you lose control
Right.
of an object because you cannot foresee the future. And it's interesting that over and over again, I have sort of the Ashoka case is a good example where he clearly felt like, okay, I have this message, I have this script, I have stone pillars. I'm gonna talk to the future. But then a lot of unexpected things happen and talking to the future is harder than you think. And then a lot of, unintentional stuff happens. So I think that's a really great point to say that it's this interplay between intention and then just other forces taking over. I end the book with a sort of similar experiment. So there's this project in Norway called Future Library, where this artist, Katie Patterson, a Scottish artist, asks authors, one author every year, to write a text, not share it with anyone,
Okay.
and then this text gets deposited in the public library of Oslo, and it will be revealed only in 100 years into the future.
Wow.
In the meantime, there's a forest that grows near Oslo, and so in 100 years, this forest will be turned into the paper from which the books will be made, on which these stories will be printed. But of course, we don't know whether this will work. And this is just 100 years. So by now, it's the project is almost 10 years old. So it's like 91 or 92 years. So we'll see. Though none of us will
be around. Wish there was a technology to hear the voices from the future.
Exactly.
It's so fascinating.
And one of the lessons I think from the book is that that may be presumptuous to think that in 100 years or 92 years.
Now that you've read so much about the past, is there a way to counter check previous things that what was intended? Did it actually happen? For example, let's take the Ashoka example.
Yeah.
If we decipher what Ashoka wanted to send the message, now over the years it has evolved.
Yeah.
But has it come as what was intended?
Yeah.
How do we?
Yeah, it's a good question. So he clearly wanted to spread Buddhism. And he was primarily thinking about the West. I think he was because, his realm was very much in cultural contact with Persia. So he really he speculated or thought about in some of the inscriptions about influencing a westward influence to Persia, but also the Middle East. And there was some influence of Buddhism, especially to Persia. But as the much larger influence was towards the east, to Tibet, to China, and then Japan. So he didn't really think about that, but that's how it panned out. So one of the interesting sources about the pillar, once the writing is no longer legible, is Xuanzang, this Chinese traveler Buddhist who comes to India because he wants to go to the source of Buddhism. And he comes across these pillars of Ashoka, and they're oral stories that connect these pillars to Ashoka, although no one can read the script anymore. And sort of impressed him. He records it as one of the things that he finds in India, and then goes back to China, and then has a big influence on Chinese Buddhism. And then I have a story of a Japanese monk who goes on a cultural mission to China and gathers a lot of material and takes it back to China. So that's the big story of Buddhism, this movement eastward. And so you could say, in some sense, Ashoka's project to spread Buddhism worked, but not exactly as he predicted.
Talking about the caves and the time period that you've mentioned. Now, if we come to the current age,
Mm.
we had pillars to scribe on. Now we are leaving digital footprints. Like, I mean, at a snap of a finger, you have thousands of content being created. So, is it culturally different? I mean, is it even sensible? I mean,
Yeah.
what's the difference between the kind of content that we generated
Yes.
generations ago
Yes.
vis-a-vis now?
Yeah.
Now that we have so many means, there were just limited means of leaving a footprint.
Mm.
Now we have numerous things where we could,
Yeah.
I mean, rather than writing 100 or the author thing that you mentioned, we can just record a video and leave it and dump it.
But
But is it? I mean, I'm sorry, you let me know when to. I mean, this is totally casual.
no, and
So no
it's great, and
informal.
it's something I think about a lot. And on the one hand, it's clear that the barrier of entry for creation is much lower, as you say, and I think that's great. It's much easier to create something. In the age of print,
Yeah.
it was became easier because books became cheaper to become a reader, but the barrier for authors was still pretty high. And I feel like one of the big changes with the digital revolution with respect to writing is that it became equally easier
Yes.
to publish. Now, how to find readers and so on and so forth is another matter, but the barrier for publishing is much lower. And I think that has to be a good thing.
Yeah.
If you believe in democracy and in access to culture, and obviously I do. But the question of the storage medium, so to speak, is an interesting one. And yes, the cost of storage
Yeah.
is almost going towards zero. And that's also something new. Creating these pillars for Ashoka or the cave paintings or many of the other examples, they took a lot of resources to produce these. And there was always kind of brutal competition. What gets preserved, which manuscripts get transcribed, and which ones are abandoned. So there's a lot of filters, always a lot of barriers. And so something interesting that happens when the cost of storage goes to zero, much more gets preserved. But so that's, again, I think that's great. On the other hand, a lot of people say that if you really want to make sure something gets preserved, print it out, because the electronic formats get obsolete very quickly. There are all these websites, all the stuff floating around that's no longer compatible. I for about 10 years, I worked for the European Research Council, and we funded a lot of digitization projects. And at some point, we realized that some of the earlier digitization from just 5, 6, 7 years ago, people had created digital archives, and they were no longer accessible. So the obsolescence, is the term they use, of digital storage is a real problem. And so and that's one of the lessons, in some sense, of this book, that just as the Brahmi script that Ashoka mostly used became illegible, so some of the coding that we entrust as a storage medium is becoming illegible or incompatible. And so this digital revolution and this lowering of the cost of storage are great, but they don't solve all the problems.
I could go on forever. But thank you. The culture of print, you said, as a storage medium, it's questionable, the digital. What about the storage medium in the mind? You teach literature. So now, if I read on a digital device, it's a personal question.
Yeah.
If you read on a digital device vis-a-vis a print
Yes.
book,
Yeah.
So is there a difference in this storage?
In this storage device, I'll have to look.
But is there a research that has happened on this subject?
There, I think there's some. I mean, I can tell you from my own anecdotal evidence, and I do some reading on digital devices now. I find it much harder to remember the name of the author, because you realize when you read a physical book, you always have lying around, you always see the cover of the book, the name of the book, the title of the book, the name of the author. When I just, read something digitally, and I read it attentively, it's not that I don't pay attention, but I have trouble remembering sometimes even the author's name, but sometimes more often, if I know the author, the precise title of the book, because I don't see it, if over the life cycle of reading a book, you've probably looked at the cover, hundreds of times. And so for me, that's actually the biggest difference in terms of what you remember. And then of course you also have other memory devices. You remember sort of where on the page maybe something is, where in the book, how you held it. There are these tactile components. I mean, I think sometimes, advocates of the book can sometimes exaggerate these features, but I think they're nevertheless real, and they help me and people, I think, to remember certain features of the book. And so the seamlessness of the digital, I think you lose that.
I mean, I just know the opportunity of showing up with a collection of books that you've read.
Yeah.
You can't do that with a digital device.
No,
Come across.
right. You have trouble name choosing. It makes the whole thing pointless.
Correct. Thanks a ton. Thank you so much, Martin, for your time.
Thank you.
Delight. Thank you for watching this video. If you also love conversations at a bookstore, please do subscribe and like this channel. And if you wish to host your favorite author over a chat, do mention the same in the comment box and witness magic happen. Please also visit our website www.rajat.corner. This is Mohit Batras signing off.